The book of Genesis is the story of what happened after God created the world and people. Through Genesis, we learn who made the world and why humans experience suffering. It also reveals God's plan through Israel. May you meditate on the entire book of Genesis through these words. Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God is the one who created something out of nothing, and He made the entire universe and the world. Genesis chapter 2. After 6 days of creation, God rested on the seventh day. Humans were created in God's image and lived in the Garden of Eden, allowed to eat from any tree except the tree of good and evil. Genesis chapter 3. Deceived by the serpent, Eve ate the forbidden fruit and gave some to Adam, leading to their disobedience. As a consequence, they were expelled from Eden. Genesis chapter 4. Eve gave birth to Cain and Abel. Cain, envious that his offerings were not accepted by God, killed Abel and became a wanderer. Genesis chapter 5. The descendants of Adam and their lifespans are listed, including Noah, linking the generations before the flood. Genesis chapter 6. As human wickedness exceeded God's patience, He decided to cleanse the earth with a flood, sparing only the righteous Noah and his family. Genesis chapter 7. Following God's instructions, Noah built an ark and took pairs of animals aboard. The flood lasted 40 days and nights, with only Noah's family and the animals on the ark surviving. Genesis chapter 8. After the flood, Noah and his family began anew. God blessed Noah and promised never to destroy the earth with a flood again. Genesis chapter 9. Post-flood, God commanded Noah and his descendants to repopulate and rebuild the earth, and established a covenant with a rainbow as a sign never to flood the earth again. Genesis chapter 10. Noah's descendants spread out and formed various nations and cultures. This chapter records the lineage of Noah's 3 sons. Genesis chapter 11. Humanity's attempt to build the Tower of Babel, against God's will, resulted in God confusing their language, dispersing people across the earth. Genesis chapter 12. God calls Abraham, promising to make him a great nation and bless him. Abraham leaves Ur of the Chaldeans for Canaan in obedience. Genesis chapter 13. Abraham and his nephew Lot, separate due to disputes among their herdsmen. Lot chooses the land of Sodom. Abraham remains in Canaan. Genesis chapter 14. When Lot is captured during a war in Sodom, Abraham rescues him with his private army. Genesis chapter 15. After rescuing Lot, Abraham is blessed by God, who reaffirms his promise of offspring and land. Abraham's faith is credited as righteousness. Genesis chapter 16. As God's promise of a child delays, Sarai suggests Abraham have a child with her servant Hagar, leading to the birth of Ishmael and household conflict. Genesis chapter 17. 13 years after Ishmael's birth, God appears to Abraham, demanding perfection and reiterating his covenant. Genesis chapter 18. Angels visit to investigate Sodom's wickedness and inform Abraham of the impending judgment on Sodom. Genesis chapter 19. Angels rescue Lot from Sodom before its destruction, prompted by the townspeople's violence. Genesis chapter 20. Abraham misleads Abimelech by calling Sarah his sister, fearing for his life, but God protects Sarah and returns her to Abraham. Genesis chapter 21. At 100, Abraham fathers Isaac, fulfilling God's promise. Genesis chapter 22. God tests Abraham by asking him to sacrifice Isaac, but spares the boy, reaffirming his promise due to Abraham's faith. Genesis chapter 23. Sarah dies, and Abraham buys a burial site from the Hittites, marking the first Hebrew claim to land in Canaan. Genesis chapter 24. Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for Isaac, who brings back Rebekah from Haran. Genesis chapter 25. Later, Abraham breathed his last and died. Genesis chapter 26. Isaac becomes very wealthy from farming, but the Philistines, out of jealousy, block his wells. After several disputes, he finally finds peace in Rehoboth. Genesis chapter 27. Isaac promises to bless Esau, but Jacob deceives his father and receives the blessing instead. Jacob flees to Haran to escape Esau's wrath. Genesis chapter 28. On the run, Jacob dreams of angels ascending and descending a ladder at Bethel and receives God's promise. Genesis chapter 29. Jacob falls in love with Rachel at Laban's house and works 7 years to marry her, but he is deceived into marrying Leah first and works another 7 years for Rachel. Genesis chapter 30. Deceived by Laban for 14 years, Jacob works and has many children, but his household experiences discord. Genesis chapter 31. Jacob flees with his share from Laban's house, but Laban pursues him. They eventually reconcile, and Jacob continues his journey. Genesis chapter 32. Returning home, Jacob fears Esau's approaching army. He wrestles with an angel at the Jabbok River, and his name is changed to Israel. Genesis chapter 33. Jacob reconciles with Esau. Esau forgives Jacob, and the brothers part ways peacefully. Genesis chapter 34. In Shechem, Jacob's daughter Dinah is dishonored, and in revenge, Levi and Simeon attack the city of Hamor. Genesis chapter 35. Directed by God, Jacob returns to Bethel, builds an altar, and worships God, overcoming his family's crisis. Genesis chapter 36. Esau settles in the region of Edom, becoming the ancestor of the Edomites, whose descendants thrive in that area. Genesis chapter 37. Joseph, envied by his brothers, is sold into slavery in Egypt. This event marks a significant turning point in Joseph's future. Genesis chapter 38. Tamar, Judah's daughter-in-law, deceives Judah into a relationship after her husband and his brother die, leading to the birth of twins. Through this, Tamar enters the lineage of the Savior. Genesis chapter 39. Joseph, in Egypt, refuses the advances of Potiphar's wife, but is falsely accused and imprisoned. Genesis chapter 40. In prison, Joseph interprets the dreams of fellow prisoners, but his help is forgotten. Genesis chapter 41. Joseph rises to become the prime minister of Egypt. After interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, preparing for an impending famine. Genesis chapter 42. Famine drives Jacob's family to Egypt for food, where Joseph tests his brothers, who sold him into slavery. Genesis chapter 43. The brothers return to Egypt, and Joseph inquires about Benjamin, testing his brother's loyalty. Genesis chapter 44. Amid a new crisis for food, Judah offers himself as a slave in place of Benjamin. Genesis chapter 45. Joseph reveals his identity to his brothers and forgives them. Genesis chapter 46. Jacob and his family move to Egypt. Genesis chapter 47. Jacob's family settles in Goshen. Genesis chapter 48. Jacob blesses Joseph's sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, giving the greater blessing to Ephraim. Genesis chapter 49. Before his death, Jacob blesses his sons, the future tribes of Israel. Genesis chapter 50. After Jacob's death, the brothers fear Joseph's revenge, but he reassures them of his forgiveness. The Israelites lived in Egypt for 430 years until the Exodus. Exodus is about the deliverance of the Israelites from suffering in Egypt by God. It spans 40 chapters, which we'll explore one by one. Exodus chapter 1. A new Pharaoh, who does not know Joseph, subjects the Israelites to hardship. Fearing their numbers, he imposes harsher conditions on them. Exodus chapter 2. Amidst oppression, Moses is born. His mother, Jochebed, places him in a basket in the Nile, where he's found and adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. Later, Moses kills an Egyptian and flees. Exodus chapter 3. At 80, Moses encounters God in a burning bush in Midian. God introduces himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and assigns Moses to rescue his people. Exodus chapter 4. Moses hesitates, citing his lack of eloquence, but God commands him to confront Pharaoh. Exodus chapter 5. Moses and Aaron ask Pharaoh to release the Israelites. Pharaoh, denying Yahweh and unwilling to lose labor, increases their burden. Exodus chapter 6. Knowing Pharaoh's stubbornness, God promises to liberate the Israelites with his power. Exodus chapter 7. Moses demonstrates God's power before Pharaoh, turning a staff into a snake and water into blood. But Pharaoh's heart remains hard. Exodus chapter 8. Despite plagues of frogs, lice, and flies, Pharaoh remains unmoved. Exodus chapter 9. Additional plagues of livestock disease, boils, and hail strike Egypt, yet Pharaoh stands firm. Exodus chapter 10. Only after locusts and darkness does Pharaoh seem to yield, but then he retracts. Exodus chapter 11. God announces the death of Egypt's firstborn, prompting preparations for the Israelites' departure. Exodus chapter 12. God instructs the Passover observance, ordering each family to prepare a lamb. Exodus chapter 13. At Passover, families slaughter a lamb at twilight, marking their doorposts with its blood to protect against the angel of death. Firstborns in homes without the blood are killed. Exodus chapter 14. After losing his son, Pharaoh allows the departure. He soon pursues them, but God parts the Red Sea, allowing Israel to cross and drowning the Egyptian army. Exodus chapter 15. Israel celebrates the crossing with song and dance, led by Miriam and the women. Exodus chapter 16. In the wilderness, the Israelites long for Egyptian meat. God provides manna and quails. Exodus chapter 17. At Rephidim, without water, they complain. God commands Moses to strike a rock, producing water. Victory over Amalek comes as Moses raises his hands, emphasizing prayer's power. Exodus chapter 18. Jethro, Moses's father-in-law, advises selecting leaders to share his burden. Exodus chapter 19. Moses ascends Mount Sinai to hear God's commandments. Exodus chapter 20. God gives the 10 Commandments, laws the Israelites must follow. Exodus chapter 21. Details on the treatment of servants and regulations for resolving disputes among neighbors are given. Exodus chapter 22 discusses laws for handling material damages between neighbors, emphasizing restitution and justice in interpersonal relationships. Exodus chapter 23 contains admonitions not to follow the majority in doing wrong, and instructions to observe God's festivals, highlighting the importance of justice and religious observance. Exodus chapter 24. Moses writes down God's commandments and seals the covenant with blood, underscoring the solemnity of the Israelites' commitment to God. Exodus chapter 25. God instructs the construction of the tabernacle for worship, including details on the Ark of the Covenant, the table for showbread, and the lampstand, signifying God's desire to dwell among His people. Exodus chapter 26. Instructions for the tabernacles. Curtains are given, emphasizing the separation and holiness of the space dedicated to God. Exodus chapter 27 describes the altar for burnt offerings, the courtyard, and the oil for the lampstand, focusing on the means and place of worship. Exodus chapter 28. Aaron and his descendants are chosen as priests, signifying the establishment of a hereditary priesthood to mediate between God and Israel. Exodus chapter 29 records the consecration ceremony for the priests, detailing the sacred rituals that set them apart for service to God. Exodus chapter 30. The altar of incense and the recipe for the incense are described, pointing to the continuous act of worship and prayer. Exodus chapter 31. Bezalel is named as the chief artisan for the tabernacle, emphasizing the role of divinely inspired craftsmanship in worship. Exodus chapter 32. While Moses is on Mount Sinai, the Israelites create and worship a golden calf, demonstrating their infidelity and impatience. Exodus chapter 33. God threatens to abandon the disobedient Israelites but relents due to Moses's intercession, highlighting Moses's role as a mediator. Exodus chapter 34. God renews the covenant, giving Moses new tablets of the 10 Commandments, and Moses's face shines after seeing God's glory, illustrating the renewal of the covenant and the impact of divine encounter. Exodus chapter 35. The construction of the tabernacle is described again, emphasizing communal involvement and contribution to the sacred space. Exodus chapter 36. Instructions are given for making the coverings for the tabernacle, stressing the detailed care and craftsmanship required. Exodus chapter 37. The construction of the ark, the table for showbread, the lampstand, and the altar of incense are detailed, focusing on the central items of worship. Exodus chapter 38. The making of the altar of burnt offering and the bronze basin are instructed, continuing the focus on the means of purification and sacrifice. Exodus chapter 39. The creation of the priestly garments is completed, and the tabernacle's furnishings are summarized, marking the completion of preparations for worship. Exodus chapter 40. The tabernacle is assembled, and God's glory fills it, represented by a cloud by day and fire by night, signifying God's presence and guidance among his people.